All right, everyone. Hi and welcome to Precog Time. This week we are talking with Michael Marcelle, who's um, a contributor to Precog issue number 4 and also a good friend and esteemed artist. Michael was born and raised in Closa, New Jersey. He received a BFA from Bard and an MFA from Yale, and we overlapped there a little bit. Did we? I can't remember. Maybe we didn't. It was like tangential, but um, and he's exhibited at Aperture, Pioneer Works, Interstate Projects, and Transmitter Gallery, among others. His work has been featured in the New Yorker, Vogue, Vice, W, Fader, and many other publications. Recent projects include a collaboration with Frank Ocean and his first book, Kokomo, which was released by Matt Editions and is an incredibly gorgeous book, which all of you should buy if you haven't already. um, Anyway, so we're really lucky to be able to talk with Michael today. And we wanted to start this off the way we start all of these off and ask you how you are. How's life in quarantine? Where are you? And what have you been getting into for the past eternity slash 4.5 months?
Yeah, so it's good. I've been in the woods. We have a little cabin upstate, which is really nice because we have a small apartment. So if we didn't have this, we would have killed each other. Uh, so I've been kind of trying to treat this almost as like a residency in a way, and just like a chance to kind of like be away. And like a lot of the kind of like more complicated aspects of at least my career, kind of like the like hustling for like editorial work and the kind of like art world hustle is kind of all on hold right now. So I've been kind of really trying to just like enjoy that and to not worry about stuff, which I mean is hard to not worry, but it's in a lot of ways it's because it's kind of like a once in a lifetime opportunity to like be quieter than usual. So I've been trying to be a little quieter.
Totally.
Um, so you've been shooting upstate?
Yeah, so I've actually been really sort of concentrating on my own artwork and not really any editorial work or anything, which has been really amazing. And also I've really kind of had a chance to re-edit some newer work, which I had been working on for about a year or so, and that I think I'll talk about a little bit, but I kind of really had a chance to change that edit around a lot in regards to just kind of what's been happening. Just having a lot of time when I didn't used to.
Yeah, I feel like one of the last times we talked about time, and this is maybe something we can get into later, but you had just gotten or had recently gotten a 9 to 5 job. And I just remember it was like maybe when you were doing Drea and my portrait for Bomb Pop-Up or something like this, and you were talking about how much you liked the 9 to 5 life, which is
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah.
So I think I'm a little bit unique in that way because I find that if I have too much time in the studio, I just go crazy and my ideas are just like not as interesting when I like just have them. So I think having less time really, I'm like kind of like an anxious guy, and I think having less time creates anxiety, which I kind of work off of and kind of helps me in a way.
The time pressure.
Yeah. And also like not really having a ton of work, I tend to get really cheap, and then like I don't want to like create new artwork because I'm just being cheap, and it just like crazy Ouroboros where I'm just like
Michael, can you talk a little bit about how your process and how you work in general?
Yeah, sure. So generally, I mean, with my artwork, I'm very sort of intuitive, and I really kind of tend to not really have like projects until they're kind of like halfway into them, and I kind of realize that I have one. And I just kind of shoot a lot, and I shoot all the time. And I think, other than a lot of photographers who like have like one idea, or they'll have an idea and they'll create work around that idea, I'm more kind of interested in like creating images that then can sort of be turned into ideas, and kind of like creating these worlds that kind of speak to some ideas which I've been sort of carrying with me over the years. So really, like every chance, like every day, every time that I'm out in the world is a chance to kind of create new work. So I'll often sort of like have my camera with me, but then also, like I'll have a lot of ideas and I'll just execute them in this studio. So it's really just like a combination of all kinds of things. So I try to be as open as I can be to like working however. And also I think I have a lot of ADD, so I really like jump around from ideas.
What do you camera? What camera do you shoot with?
I have a Canon Mark III. I'm like extremely like not a camera guy.
There's like a different kinds of photographers. Some it's
Oh
really
yeah.
important, and then for others, there's like no, whatever. Like they don't want to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I am kind of super interested in like using the technologies that are kind of like common in our world right now. So I tend to not ever really shoot analog because, there are a lot of photographers who have a good reason to, but I also think it can be kind of a crutch, and like I don't necessarily always understand why you wouldn't want to use the tools that are part of our lives to talk about what you want to talk about. So that's kind of all I really care about.
It's interesting to hear you describe your process, because I feel like if I didn't know what your work looks like, the way that you talk about it would make it seem as though you're like, a street photographer or something like this.
Yeah.
In reality, like you're just walking around with your camera and find things. When in reality, you have such a distinct aesthetic, and it turns out that the bodies of work that you produce are in their own ways so specific and like so centered around a subject. So I'm gonna start showing images from the Kokomo body of work, but I mean that work is specifically about a response to Hurricane Sandy, and a surreal meditation certainly on this subject, but not anyway. So I'm just going to open it at that. Like, you have a very, very particular aesthetic framework which kind of organizes.
And I think a lot of that comes into play in like editing, which is really like a huge aspect of my work. I shoot like a ton, and oftentimes I'll shoot like hundreds and hundreds of images, and I'll just use like one of them. And I think like that's really kind of a crucial part of why my work looks the way it looks, is because I'm really trying to sort of create work that like I feel like I've never looked at and I'm sorry, and I think oh sorry, I have a little bit of an echo.
Sometimes there's an echo. If you just mute yourself for a second and unmute yourself, it stops. Let's see if it will work.
How's that? Did that work? Yeah. Okay, great. So anyway, I think I create like a lot of images that kind of like look like very sort of like what you would expect with photography, just like, and I try really hard to like cut out a lot of work that, even if I like really am really into it, if it like reminds me of anyone else or anything else, I'll just sort of get rid of it because I really want this work to feel very cohesive and very tight in a very alien and uncanny way. Yeah.
Um, ugh, is that echo? Okay. We're looking at three bodies of work, right? Right now, right?
No, this is just Kokomo.
Okay. No, but
We will be looking at 3 different
okay.
things of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you decide what images belong together.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So Kokomo was kind of easy because it was sort of about my home and about my immediate family, and it was sort of about this kind of like wreckage of the hurricane and trauma, and it was kind of easy to put that work into a box. Red Strawberry 2, which is what came after, was really just the work that I was working on at the time. That was kind of my first big like project after Kokomo. So I was kind of just trying to work, and I was really imagining those images as kind of in the same world that was created in Kokomo, but sort of like eons in the future, where this sort of alternate reality, this sort of mutation had become kind of homogenized and sort of had become the regular world. So that work all to me felt very like cloyingly kind of colorful and sweet and like kind of like too ripe in a way. And I wanted it all to feel kind of like hallucinations of like computer renderings, almost just like these dream worlds. And I wanted to like really not be in our reality at all, where Kokomo and the work that I have now is kind of a bit more tied to reality. But Red Strawberry 2 is just like this other world.
Michael, when you introduced this body of work, you talked about it just now as extending the glitch which had occurred in Kokomo. Can you talk about what that means for you? Is that like, what is that?
Yeah. So I think, in Kokomo, I was really interested in this idea of mutation, and like a lot of the bodies had kind of changed, and I was sort of altering them a lot. And I was sort of interested in like sort of materializing the trauma of the hurricane onto the body in a very real way. And I think in Red Strawberry 2, I think Kokomo is more about horror, and Red Strawberry 2 is kind of about sci-fi in a way. Like I tend to, I'm really into like the idea of a genre, and a lot of what I'm inspired by is kind of like low schlock culture that kind of isn't in the art world. So Red Strawberry was kind of this idea of like, just like if this world in Kokomo, this mutation had sort of not corrected its health, but had become the regular world, and like what that would be like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in the future. But that's just, who knows?
It's the suburban lifestyle dream, Michael.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you you mentioned horror? Can you talk about the influence of horror? So are you thinking about film, or where are you drawing your, there's a lot of shadows, but also there's a lot of color that reminds me of like Technicolor film, very saturated.
Yeah. So horror, yes, I could talk about quite a bit. So yeah, I think like generally a lot of my interests in horror and sort of queerness even sort of come from like when I was sort of like 12 or so, and it's kind of like a queer, chubby, awkward kid in this town, and my escape was like through a lot of these kind of pop cultural like horror films and like just kind of like albums and that kind of stuff, and that kind of in a way became what my art is really about. And I used to go to the rental store as a kid, and I would like just hang out in the horror part for like hours and just like look at all the boxes, and just because like I couldn't watch any of those, so I would just like, and I don't really shoot any horizontal images, and I think a lot of that is because I was so inspired by all the movie boxes and that kind of like window into this other world. So yeah, so like a lot of my core influences are like out of horror, and I think that in a way horror is just like a genre that to me can kind of easily speak to a lot of kind of existential human ideas, and kind of like automatically can sort of elevate them through allegory. Like I can't like I have like a really hard time like watching like regular stuff, and my husband and I actually kind of argue about that, because like he'll just be like, let's just watch like a reality show, and I just like can't, because like I need like extremes, and that's what horror gives me.
Michael, you mentioned queerness, and I think this is something that comes up a lot in the way you're thinking about your images. Can you talk a little bit about how you define it? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I think with my work, queerness is sort of like a worldview, and it's kind of imagining this sort of other world, and again, it is kind of tied to this idea of when I was young and this kind of escapism in this other world, and I kind of tied my queerness to all these elements. And I think a lot of like queer artists will sort of make work that's about the body as the point of queerness and as a point of like a desire, and I'm interested in the body as a point of the uncanny, and being kind of both arousing and horrifying at the same time. And I'm interested in like queerness as this kind of like radiating consciousness that's kind of like in everything in the world, and I think color and technicolor kind of ties to that as well, because I think like a lot of the early sort of technicolor dramas were like had like certain elements of camp in them, and I just think that like a lot of artists who I really admire, there's like a excess to color, or the kind of color that I'm interested in, that to me feels inherently queer, I think.
Well, it seems it's really interesting to hear you talk about photography in this way as like depicting the world visibly even, but not in a way that we experience it, right? So that like the psychological world, or the way. Uh-huh. Oh, did I cut off? Sorry about that. That like in a sense, photography is the mechanism, like is the apparatus which allows us to see horror, the uncanny, color in this particular sense. And there's a way in which I think this is tied to abstraction, right? And the ways in which your work abstracts, whether that's by like the framing that you impose on an image, or the way in which bodies never appear as whole, which I know is something that you also talk about. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of these decision-making strategies as you move through the work, and present like bodies of work and a sense of aesthetics which feels so continuous, and so like your sensibility, as we've talked about, is so strong and yet does not actually indicate a cohesive or coherent world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because kind of up until this new work, I was really sort of interested in creating these alternate realities that were sort of over overlaid on top of ours, but kind of were not of our own. And I think that really came out of just like being in grad school and just, I got to grad school and I instantly was really kind of like over a lot of types of photography. And I was really kind of just like wanting to really just like see things that were sort of like elevated and not, sorry, to like see a kind of like a like just like a spectrum of the world that felt like ours but felt not quite like ours. And I think honestly, a lot of my work is cut very closely, and a lot of that is because it's hard to keep that kind of extremity and like art and like control the wider and wider that you go in the world, because it becomes more and more recognizable as our world. So I think, I think that abstraction really just had to do with like wanting to see, I think with Kokomo, I really wanted to see how far I could like get the intimate towards like oblivion, and like to like see how close I could take this like really, like home, and to see how far out it could go towards this kind of like annihilation into this other world and still feel meaningful in a way. And I think that that is kind of the line that my work is always sort of like trying to walk on, and it's not always well, that I'm trying to kind of like draw this line between like abstraction and like wildness, and also having some kind of like emotional impact. Because I think like the worst parts about my work, you could say it looks like album covers. You know what I mean? Not the harsh one, but you know what I mean?
There's like an asterisk there where we can ask you like about your work with music literally, which we can do a little later on. But I actually kind of following from this conversation, I was gonna ask, the work, at least these bodies of work that we're kind of looking at, move from the really intensely personal and your focus on home, literally, through Red Strawberry to your most recent body of work, The Living End, which you talk about as being kind of more depersonalized, like sort of a sort of larger meditation on the body, ideas about horror, and as you were even mentioning earlier, less reliant on the concept of the fantastical or the phantasm, this sort of like spectral color, and more rooted again in quote unquote the world. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this body of work, and also how you move between the personal and like the very intimate and a sort of larger sense of, or the less intimate, let's put it that way.
Yeah, so this new work is like still kind of like in the middle, so I don't usually talk about it, but I thought like we're with friends, so yeah, why not? So this work is kind of like I think kind of a big change from what I usually do, and it's been really hard in that way. And so this work has no sort of like fixed location, and it's not about home at all, and it's kind of like I've been sort of like imagining it as kind of like a some kind of a mutation of like sort of classic road trip photography project. And that's kind of like traveling through like American oblivion in a way. And I think where my old work was sort of about control, this work is about chaos. And so there's actually no altering of any of the images, whereas in my older work, I would do a lot of manipulation, a lot of altering, but not to everything, because I wanted to put everything into question, where like you're kind of walking through a dream where you can't tell what's real and what's not real. But here it's all kind of shot in camera, and in that way it's kind of my most traditional work, which has been weird. It's been kind of like a response to, I think, Red Strawberry 2 kind of went like all the way into this one world, and I kind of wanted to come back to reality. So to me, this new work is like squarely in our world, it's, squarely in our reality. And I think I still don't really know how to talk about it because it's just so new and it's so in progress, but it feels, what was the last half of your question? I'm sorry.
I was wondering how you move through like the intensely personal to these kind of more depersonalized. Maybe they're not really depersonalized, but like using your family and your home as the basis for the construction of a worldview to not, or like kind of setting your sights on like Americana is clearly a big deal in this body of work, like more explicit visual meditations on like society and the kind of like human environment or something like this.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think in a way, I was just kind of interested in like speaking on a wider scale, and it was really just kind of a challenge to myself, because I've spent 10 years kind of like working at home, working with all the same tools, and I really kind of like wanted to sort of introduce some new ideas. A lot of this was shot, in the spring after everything happened, but also a lot of it is a lot older, and I've kind of it's like a year and a half old, and I've just been kind of like re-editing it in a way to have it feel wider and more kind of like about this kind of like idea of this kind of like road trip, not a road trip, but just like kind of like speaking to photographers who like I wasn't really that interested in, like Robert Frank and like Winogrand, who like I'm just like I just wasn't ever kind of that interested in, and even like Arbus, who I'm extremely interested in, but like just this idea of like speaking about work that's about the world. And I also think, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how this work and how all my work relates to race and how it connects to whiteness, because I think, right now white artists are sort of obligated to speak on it. And I think it would be like incredibly lame if I was like, oh yeah, like you could argue that this work is about race, like, just like, it's always been about race, because it wasn't. And that's because I like had the naivete and I had the kind of like ability to sort of create these other worlds and to not have to like worry about reality. And I think that that's how whiteness is a part of this work and of all my work, is that like, just that like I didn't have to sort of consciously address these issues. And so
a question about, what do you think about the way in which this moment, all these protests are being photographed? how this time is being documented?
I mean, so the only thing that I really think is important about it is that there's a equalizing of like who the voices are and like who the photographers are, and I think that that's a really great opportunity. You know, I'm just really hoping that that sort of comes through, and that like editors and like all the magazines are really sort of like trying to give the power back to the voices who matter. And I think like as a white man, I'm really kind of trying to not be in the middle of the conversation. So like I kind of don't have a ton to say about that because I think like I'm really only here to advocate as an ally. So like I would rather whoever else kind of speak to it, because you know.
And I had another question, because I was thinking about how you know, you get commissioned work, and then I'm sure you shoot some things. You go on a project, and there's some things that you take out for your own work, and I guess that would be more like a fine art thing. And then I was just thinking about how, if you think, or how, what's that, I don't know, the real difference between like these different kinds of photography, and is there a hierarchy of images? Because there's also, you know, Instagram, and it's, you have to like, you know, think about what's the value of this, or, you know.
Yeah. So I think, you know, it's all really interesting. And I think because my work draws from kind of pop culture and like, you know, horror films and like MTV and like advertising and all that stuff, like I'm a lot more open to those ideas than I think a lot of artists are. And I also have been like extremely fortunate in that like all the editors who I've ever worked with have been like amazing. And you know, I think because my work is so extreme, I kind of only get hired for jobs that like speak,
Makes sense.
you know, like I'm not being hired for like regular stuff, which is really cool. But so, you know, I think in a lot of ways I kind of view it the other way around, where like the art world is at a deficit because it can feel so sort of tied off and exclusive and so archaic in a way that like, you know, if you have a show in Chelsea, like how many eyeballs will actually be on that work? Like a few hundred, you know, it just, and I'm just more interested in like creating the images and then sort of like worrying about where they end up or how they end up. And with this new work, it's been very interesting because, you know, I've been sort of like at some like weird, you know, I go to like Comic-Con every year and I go to these rodeos, and I use my credentials to get access. But oftentimes I don't have a client, like I just go because I want to go. So work that I used to kind of just think would be editorial, now I go just because it's a like a chance, and like who knows what can happen. So that's been a really sort of interesting new way to work, because I think I used to be much more hierarchical and much like snottier. And I think, you know, like a lot of that is like our education and like, you know, this culture that we, you know, we've all been sort of raised in this art world.
Something that I was thinking about just listening to you now and going through the images in the living end, is that the structure of your work, and especially your reliance and interest in horror and science fiction, and to a certain degree, like the idea of an uncanny present or something like this, the present as itself uncanny, makes it really possible for the work to be critical, right? Like, and especially moving away from like what I would have earlier sort of described as a portrait, which were also really unsettled, right? Like the portraits of your sister or something like this, it's like they're extremely, they're not like any kind of traditional portrait, and certainly ideas about like what a portrait even might be in that context are brought into question. But especially because in that last body of work, I know this is a little bit of a run-on question, but like there's so many images of money. You know, it's like there's like piles of money, this like blindingly white, speaking of whiteness, like Wrangler dude who kind of looks like the Marlboro man, you know, with his cowboy hat. Um, and, you know, like interjections of different kinds of industry, whether that's screen and VR or like this sort of post-industrial machine um, language. I was wondering if you could, and maybe it's too early, but I was wondering if like in this body of work you are sort of trying to like getting into that very photographic tradition that you were talking about earlier, which is, you know, talking about quote unquote America with this photographic gaze, which is more or less critical, like from Robert Frank through, you know, like Lee Friedlander and whoever else, right? And okay, I know this is again a huge question, but I wonder if you could talk about your relationship to staging in those photographs, like whether staging is important and um, how that might relate to the kinds of ideas you're working with.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a good question. So yeah, I think that like my criticality is, I'm. It's interesting. It's like I'm less. I think in a year like this, it would be naive of me to say that like I'm not interested in criticality, because like that would be like because of my accent, like that, like I wouldn't have to be. But I think that the work is more interested in the idea of like spectacle, and kind of like America right now is kind of like everything all the time. And I think rather than being about a utopia or a dystopia, it's about kind of like sliding between the two, and this kind of like world that's sort of like constantly mutating between the two, and this kind of like constant sort of like flux. And I think that like that's where my interests lie, where like it's both critical and sort of less critical, because I think that, you know, I'm also really interested in the idea of an image being like the idea of a beauty in the work. And I think that like that's like a big part of my work, is like that these images are very not attract, but like that, like, you know, there's like an eye on aesthetics, and I think that like they can be very alluring and also kind of horrible. And I think that that kind of ties to this idea of the uncanny, is that like it's this kind of like, it's like a little bit of both. What was the other part of the question?
Staging.
Staging, yeah. So I think like in my older work, that was like a huge aspect of my practice. But I think now, you know, a lot of those images are sort of out in the world, but I think what's important to me is to not have kind of a hierarchy between how the images are made. So like, you know, there's an image of an orange rind where I drew myself on it. And, you know, that I mean, it's kind of obvious that that's not in the world, but I don't particularly care. And I think that that's also kind of like what's ultimately really crucial about photography, is that it's entirely a lie and entirely true all the time, and you can kind of constantly choose like what aspects of that you want to sort of adhere to. And I think that's what I'm most interested with photography, is how tied it is into reality, but also it's just a total lie all the time. It's really fucked up. I don't mean it to sound like that.
No, yeah.
Good. Should we open up for questions, Gabby?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. first, in sort of in relation to this last conversation, Judy, um, Nate Hygis, who's performing on Zoom as Judy Massage, which is a great alias. Hi, Nate. Asks, especially regarding staging, do you think about the difference between theatricality and cinematography? And the difference between photographing a play versus making a movie?
That's an amazing question. I mean, I haven't, but now I will. Sure. No, I think what I'm really interested about film is how, everything is sort of like tied into a box, and how that is kind of like all that you get and all the information that you have, whereas theater is more of like about space and like a dimensionality. And I'm kind of interested in like flattening the world. And there's a quote by maybe Winogrand, I should know this, that he says that the reason why he makes photography is because he wants to see how the world looks like in photography. And I think that that's like kind of also what I'm really interested in, is like the way the world becomes transformed in a square when it's flat. If that answers.
That's great. And Nancy wanted to know if you've been influenced at all by David Lynch. Sorry?
Yeah, yes. I mean, sure. I mean, I think Mulholland Drive is like one of the greatest of all time. Actually, a week ago, I was chatting with my husband about that scene in the diner where the guy recalls the dream and then he walks in the back. And I was saying that I think that might be the greatest moment of any movie of all time. So yeah, I would say so. Probably.
If any of y'all have more questions, please send them along. But I have a question that I wanted to ask you about, which is, could you talk a little bit more about color as a kind of protagonist in your work? Like I was thinking, obviously the way that saturation works is really specific, and when you're talking about Kokomo and Red Strawberry, the idea that it's sort of intentionally oversaturated to help us understand that things are off is important, or that they're in a kind of altered state. But I was also thinking about the relationship between your color, the color that you use, and like the experience of stained glass, or like devotionally lit experiences. You know what I mean?
That's wild. So first, I want to say that I will often like go online and just like research like images of jewels, and just like big like handfuls of jewels, which I think kind of like speak to that, what you're saying. I think it's interesting because I feel like everyone sort of talks about color with my work a lot, which I totally get, but I also sort of about light in a way, and that's kind of the part of the work that's the wildest. And I think like color is really only about how much light comes in and out of it. And I think that I'm so, but to like speak to what you're asking, I think that color to me, just kind of, I just kind of can't help it. And it's just like, it's so interesting because like, it really just kind of like speaks to just like the way that I view the world. And I've just always been really drawn to it as like as the kind of activating agent to the work. And I just, I really, it's kind of like always at the front of my mind. And so, what's interesting with this new work, where a lot of it is like totally natural light and that kind of stuff. Is that what's been on my mind recently, which is like a little hippie and a little like, I've been like smoking a lot of weed, but like this idea that like all the natural light in the world comes from this like huge, weird cosmic thing in the sky, in this crazy idea of like a universe, and like how crazy that is. And like I've been kind of trying to like imagine that like, shouldn't the photography that's of light in the world kind of like speak to that sort of a degree of like craziness and how like impossible that is? And like, why would you make an image that like couldn't at least hope to try to like talk about the universe? Like, you know what I mean? I mean, that's so
Totally.
stupid. But, like, that's
No,
been
yeah.
on my mind.
Well, I was thinking also that like the way that you use color makes like really foregrounds ideas about illumination, and also the way that light is something which connects people and connects surfaces, like in your use of gels or something like this, right? Like the green does not pertain to someone's face, like it is displaced from something else, and it will like unite all of the green elements that are affected by the same light gel. And
Yeah.
so this sort of like activation or like theatricalization of applied color as opposed to like inherent color or something like this, if that's even a thing.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, the idea of color in photography is that like it can sort of like instantly just sort of like add a narrative element. And I think that's kind of what you're sort of like speaking to, where it like draws connections where there otherwise sort of wouldn't be.
Right.
Yeah.
So Josh wants to know if there are any films that you consider queer horror canon, whether that's overt and intentional by the filmmaker or not.
I mean, yeah, sure. I would say, you know, a lot of like Italian horror, a lot of Argento, the Suspiria. I would say that the new Suspiria, which a lot of people, I can't believe I'm talking about, I mean, of course I'm talking about this. A lot of people were like not that into it, but I am extremely into it. And I think it's like a masterwork. And I think it's extremely queer in a lot of ways. I think, you know, there's a lot of sort of like Lovecraftian horror films that sort of like address the body and like changes in the body. And I think a lot of those can sort of speak to an idea of queerness. Brain Damage, which is this really like schlocky horror film that I love. It's about a guy who, it's really not worth talking about. Yeah, there are like a lot of them, but they're like extremely ridiculous. And I, you know, and I think for me, it's sort of tied also to like kind of anger and like that kind of horror where, I mean, I wouldn't call this work horror, but I would say it's certainly like using the same tools of horror. It's horror adjacent, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot. And, you know, it really is kind of like, those are the things that like I look at. I don't tend to look, I mean, I am obviously very interested in photography, but I don't always look at photography always.
What are you watching now?
We're watching the new Unsolved Mysteries. I don't know if you guys have watched any of those episodes, including the one about the UFO, which has really sort of, okay, so actually I'm like a real skeptic. Like I love UFOs, I love aliens, I love haunted houses, but I'm extremely like skeptical of all that. And I think a lot of my work is kind of about that idea, that kind of like hopeful optimism of like magical stuff, but then also realizing that it's like not real, but it's kind of trying to sort of have that be real. And this episode with the UFO has kind of changed my mind a little bit.
Like you believe it's true now?
I don't want to spoil anything, but they have no, I don't know why they'd be lying. You know, they have no reason.
Drea has a question, which is sort of continuing our a little bit a part of our earlier conversation, which is she says, listening to you speak and looking at the images, I can't help but think about surface and how it relates to both beauty and theater. I think your treatment of color, light, and space is related to this concept that denotes volumes beneath. Could you tell us more about how you're thinking about surface, maybe as a material and also as a concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what I was speaking about with
Yeah.
my interest in photography as this kind of like flattener, and I think I'm extremely interested in that, and I think I say I don't look a lot at like other photographers, but like I do look at like a lot of like a lot of like a lot of like
Interest?
yeah, well, yeah, but also just like a lot of like say just like all the painters who I know like Drea's work, who like I really love, and I think I'm really sort of like interested in that idea where like you guys kind of don't have a choice, like like your tool is inherently flat and you have to create the space, whereas with what I do, it's like the opposite, where like all I have is the space and it's my job to kind of like squeeze it down and have it become this two-dimensional object.
Michael, we
Oh,
didn't ask yet. What was it like to work with Frank Ocean?
that was my question.
Time for the gossip.
It was great. It was fun. I still have a NDA, so
So you can't really talk about it.
But
Okay.
it was really great. He was really great. Everyone on his team is like amazing. It was kind of a dream job in a way because it was very collaborative. He was extremely open, and he really kind of like was open to allowing me to go wherever I wanted. And he had a lot of great ideas. Yeah, I mean, like it was kind of like a dream. We spent a lot of time with each other last year on a couple of things. It was great, and like I had a couple of colleagues who were already sort of in that world, so it was kind of cool, hanging out with some friends. Yeah, it was great.
Very mysterious.
I know. I'm sorry.
Do you want to? Is that something you would want to do more? Because you're talking about looking at album covers. Would you want to be interested in shooting more kind of music-related things?
Yeah. I mean, it really sort of just depends on what the opportunity is, and I think yeah. I mean, if they're all like that, yeah. For sure. It was very cool.
And you've never made a video or like tried to make video?
So I tried in grad school, and I had it at a crit, and they said to not ever do
that again. They love to say that though.
Yeah. No, I think the thing that because I think I talk about like the horror movies and all this stuff a lot, but I think that how that stuff becomes interesting in my work is how it's that sort of change from a movie to an image, and I think that like that's what I'm interested in, is kind of like what happens in that change, and also working in that type of a world is like so complicated and so expensive, and I tend to like work well alone a lot of the time, and I'm like, yeah.
Cool. I was gonna say, I wonder if we have time in the midst of all of this to ask you about your, like, what you think about narrative, um, and like whether you want, I mean, obviously when you build a body of work, and especially as a photographer, someone who's making a book, like you have to be thinking about about sequence and how images relate to one another. Um, but I wonder whether or how you think about the images demanding a kind of narrative engagement on an individual basis, and whether that's something that's important to you.
Yeah, so I think in a way that's been kind of like the sort of challenge of the way that I work, in that even sort of like when I was first working on Kokomo, I had been working at home for like a year, and whenever I would talk about the work, I'd be like, I want this work to be about photography and not about home, which is like incredibly naive and incredibly just like stupid. And I think like my work only becomes interesting when there's kind of like a narrative element, and I think that like that's why the work is always, there's not like, I don't release like a lot of work, like, because I think it's hard, it's hard, you know. And I think I think I'm so interested in the image that I can sometimes get lost like in the narrative and just get kind of like charmed at the way that they look, kind of. So I think that, but at least I'm aware of that and like trying to change.
Cool. Well, I feel like that's a really good place to end the formal part of this conversation. And so all of you should thank you for, again, for letting us ask you questions and being so generous with your images and time, Michael. And also everyone, you're free to just hop in. Please join us.
Yeah, and then we are going to be talking
next week to Alana Harris Babu.
That's the 5th. Yeah.
At 7. She's great. Yay!